Hello, this is a short video on validity and educational measurement that focuses largely on general ideas about validity and a few of the ways that it has been historically defined and currently defined. So validity, pretty much regardless of which particular definition is adopted, has for decades been viewed not as a property of a test, but as a property of the interpretations and uses of a test. So the question that validity or validation studies try to answer is how accurate as representations of what is to be measured, and how useful for our purpose are test-derived scores for the interpretations and uses you want to make of them. And just to get into a couple of these things, accuracy or rightness or correctness, appropriateness, those all are considered aspects of accuracy. What is to be measured is your construct. Usefulness for our purpose, and these can be the purposes of different people, but you validate test scores or test score interpretations and uses for a stated purpose. If the purpose of use changes, then the validation activity has to be started again. And it says, I want to make of them. In the literature, it is not only incumbent on the people who develop the test to validate the test interpretations and use, it is incumbent on the people who use the test. And that particularly is the case when test interpretations or uses are made for populations or groups that the test was not originally designed to measure, or for new interpretations and uses. And the last thing, I have headed this validity. Many people prefer the term validation as it seems more process oriented, because validation is an activity, a research activity that usually often is performed continuously. So the only other thing here that I want to draw your attention to is that the more critical a use or interpretation of test scores, then the stronger the evidence should be. And this also applies, as you've seen, to reliability. A test that is intended to make very strong decisions to be used for that purpose should be highly reliable. And one of the ways we will describe a test like that is we'll call it high stakes, by which we mean that there are decisions made that affect individuals or groups in ways that cannot easily be overturned. So you can think, for instance, of a licensing exam where if a person fails that, and perhaps it was a poor decision because the test was poorly designed, it would be difficult monetarily for the person to have another chance at that test. The relationship between reliability and validity is strong. Reliability is considered a necessary but not sufficient condition. In other words, you have to have reliability to have validity, but it's not enough. And this is the idea of a necessary but not sufficient condition is common throughout the sciences. You can say that in order to have a flame, you have to have a spark, but a spark is not sufficient. You also need to have oxygen. Neither one is a sufficient condition, but they are both necessary conditions. So you can have a set of test scores that are very reliable but are not valid. You can have a set of test scores that are not at all reliable. If you do, they cannot be valid for any purpose. And reliability is a property of scores. Validity is a property of the interpretation or use of scores. So you've already seen something like the graphics that are displayed here, showing the relationship between reliability and validity. And if you think of the general target as a very broadly defined construct, and your intention in measurement is to center on a key aspect of this construct, recognizing that there are other less key aspects, but having chosen a key component as your central focus, then you're focusing your measurement on the red bullseye. If you imagine that each of the black dots are a set of scores on a sample of test takers, then you can see that sometimes when you administer this test, your scores are not highly focused on the construct. They're not hitting the target. Once they are, most of the time they're not. Really, it's a scatter shot. And if you were trying to predict from a set of scores what another measurement would encompass in terms of what it was measuring, you'd have no prediction. You essentially have unreliable scores because they don't form any particular pattern. They have no correlation with one another. And you also have no validity because you can't state what aspect of a construct you're measuring. And in fact, one of your shots is even outside the entire construct domain. This is a case where we have high reliability. Our distributions of test scores are tightly clustered. They're all honing in on some aspect of your general construct, but they are not honing in on the key aspect that you are trying to measure. So this would be a case where you have high reliability, your scores are quite precise, but they're inaccurate. They're not hitting where you want to be hitting. And this could be a case of bias. We're not going to talk about bias yet, but if you have a systematic misrepresentation, say you're always interpreting this scores as being at the key place, but they're not, then this could be a kind of bias. Your interpretation will be systematically wrong. And our third graphic here is the ideal. You have precise measurement. Any given measurement is, or set of scores is a reliable representation of an expected set of scores on the same population. And also you're consistently hitting the aspect of the construct that you intended to hit. So as you can see, on the left, you can have reliability without validity. At the bottom, you have the case of no reliability and also therefore no confidence that you're measuring what you intended to measure, no validity, and on the left, both reliability and validity. So I'm just going to go through 3 of the ways that validity has been conceptualized. And this is one of the older views. It isn't, none of these are specifically tied to historical periods. So this tripartite, some people call it the Trinitarian view, looks quite separately at three areas that can be used for a validation argument. People didn't at this time talk about a validation argument. Basically, they could be used to demonstrate validity. There was no expectation that a set of test scores should show all aspects. Content was specifically the focus of educational measurement. Criterion was specifically the focus of like work-related and selection decisions in measurement, and like how predictive. Criterion is a form of predictive validity, and construct was the domain of psychology, theories of learning, theories of motivation, things like that, where you had obviously quite hypothetical human attributes that were not the sorts of things you find in a set of content standards. So this is an old-fashioned, but you will still see it. And in fact, you will see it in my presentations because it's a simple way of looking at things. And traditionally, the content people were one group of people, the criterion group of people were another group of people, and this is historically the case. These three approaches to validity came out of very different historical areas of research. Then you have, in 1989, in a chapter of kind of the Bible of educational measurement, which is called Educational Measurement. And 1989, a man named Samuel Messick, who is a major figure in educational measurement, wrote a chapter on validity. And his idea was not unique, but his chapter really set it out in a very complicated but very thorough way that all validity was construct validity. In other words, all validity had to do with whether you were accurately and appropriately measuring the construct that was the focus of measurement. And you could look into that using a variety of approaches, but it all came down to construct validity. Again, kind of if you look at the idea of necessary but not sufficient conditions, if you had a demonstration of criterion validity, you couldn't claim that that was validity because you might not have an interpretation of construct validity or consequential validity or content validity. My favorite example, because this came from my dissertation advisor, was that if you had an instrument, if accurately throwing basketballs into a trash can predicted freshman GPA, then throwing basketballs into a trash can was an appropriate criterion measure of freshman GPA. And it was irrelevant that the constructs of measured, instantiated by freshman GPA and by basketball throwing were completely different. As long as you had good criterion, good predictive validity. This is pretty much obviously nonsense. And it shows the limitations of the view that one approach to validation was sufficient or really could be used to describe the accuracy of the measurement of the construct. You'll notice that the other thing that Messick put in that had not been really emphatically treated, various authors, including Cronbach, who you've heard of before, had raised this issue, in some cases quite emphatically, but had not really put it into a strong framework, is consequential validity. And Messick was quite clear that test developers were responsible for demonstrating that the consequences of test use and the consequences of test interpretation were appropriate for the given purpose. Also, you can note, and we will discuss this later, that content is a lesser form of construct validity. The current dominant conception of validity is very similar in its approaches to test validation as Messick, but rather than focusing on individual sources of evidence, it focuses on the quality of the overall argument for validation. Validation is still an argument directed at the appropriateness of the uses and interpretations of a test for making decisions about a people's standing on a construct. So it's still kind of all about construct validity. But the focus of the argument-based approach to validation, which was really set forward by Michael Kane, I think he kind of launched onto that in the early 2000s, and he wrote the chapter on validity or validation in the, I believe it's the third edition of the educational measurement volume. He focused on the overall process of building the validity argument. And his premise was that any claim for validity of uses or interpretations was based on certain assumptions, just like you have statistical assumptions, it was based on assumptions about the quality of the scores, for instance, their reliability, the quality of the relationship of the content of the test to any stated intentions about what should be covered, etc. And that because there could be different assumptions for different test interpretations and uses, a test developer might be selective about the approaches that they used, but they needed to consider the full argument, and their argument could be poked at. The ways they would consider building this argument would be based on gathering multiple sources of evidence. And Kane calls these things warrants in the evidence that supports the assumptions is a warrant for making the assumption. And in a validation study, if you want to demonstrate that test use or interpretation, and I'll generally just say tests are valid rather than test use or interpretation. I'll just use the short form, but it is test use or interpretation. Actually, it's score use or interpretation. But with assumptions, if we want to demonstrate that a test is valid, we want to support its assumptions. And in terms of the relationship between Kane's types of evidence and the other frameworks, one of the types of evidence that Kane says we might look to is the content of the test. One is what he calls and many people have called, so there's lots of people who write about validity, and he calls external structural evidence, which is part your criterion evidence and part your construct evidence. And that's the way that that construct has achieved some kind of primacy, is that everything feeds into it. Criterion feeds into it. And the consequences, I don't know of an argument that has really stated consequences in terms of constructs, but but that's one of the ways that consequential evidence continues to be a source of some controversy. Otherwise, internal structural, which we will talk about in more detail, that relates to the dimensionality. If you have a complex construct, are you accurately covering on the test? Is the test useful for making interpretations about all of the complexities of the construct? And he talks about substantive process evidence, which we will have a little focus on. That also has been around for a very long time, but is coming to a greater level of attention recently. And that's actually focusing on the mental, even physical processes that test takers use to generate responses to a test and how well those match their actual scores. So a person creates responses to items on a multiple choice test, and they fill in little Scantron bubbles. And we think, if it's a math test, that their responses are relevant to their knowledge of math concepts and procedures. Substantive process answers the question, tries to answer the question, are they really based on knowledge of math concepts and processes, or is something else going into their responses, such as motivation or lack thereof, such as language skills, such as anxiety. All kinds of things might go into those behaviors that we actually only see as item responses, and substantive process look into what is actually going on in the test taker as they perform the behavior that yields the scores. And these are multiple sources of evidence. Kane argues for multiple sources of evidence, not just from one area. That's hard to do. Nobody argues that you should be kind of comprehensive and gather evidence from all of these sources, but Kane does make the argument that anyone has the right, particularly any researcher, who are the people who would generally have the opportunity to provide counter arguments against the assumptions. And if there's a strong counter argument, there needs to be more evidence gathering. And that can be by other researchers, it can be by the test developers, it can be by courts of law, but the validation argument isn't fixed once it's been made. And so we build this thing called the interpretive argument that starts with what are the proposed interpretations, what's the purpose, what are the assumptions underlying this purpose and interpretations and uses from the scores, and what is the evidence, or what are the warrants for those assumptions. And that's all for this presentation. It's just an overview of the ways a validation approach have been conceptualized. And I will use a combination of approaches. I lean towards the interpretive argument myself, for the argument-based approach of Kane, who, by the way, sponsored my dissertation. He wasn't one of my advisors, but I had funding for my dissertation, and it was sponsored by the National Conference of Bar Examiners, and he was head of measurement for them at the time. And so I lean towards his approach. It is the most contemporary approach, but not everybody takes it. And I include the Trinitarian or old three-legged stool for convenience sake sometimes, and but also recognize the importance of consequences and that everything comes down to construct, which is Messick's contribution. So most people, I think, do the same thing, is there are elements of each approach that they adopt for practical use. And until next time.